William Shakespeare, considered to be one of the greatest playwrights ever born. He wrote plays like Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, and A Midsummer Night's Dream. But there's another one of his works that may have been lost to history. It's called Cardenio. You won't find it in a book or on stage, but perhaps in an adaptation of it from 1727, a play going by the name Double Falsehood, which claims to have preserved the bard's original script. But is this an elaborate hoax, or a genuine Shakespearean play? To be or not to be, that is the question. Act 1. The curtain closes. We open this story with a death. On the 23rd of April 1616, following an illustrious career of playwriting and poetry, William Shakespeare dies, aged 52. Now, it's not certain how he passed, but the local vicar wrote later that Shakespeare and his friends, quote, had a merry meeting and, it seems, drank too hard, for Shakespeare died of a fever there contracted. During his lifetime, Shakespeare did not publish any of his plays himself. It seems like he expected his extraordinary works to die with him, or simply fade away from history. The only written record of Shakespeare's plays during his lifetime were through little pamphlets called quartos. These quartos were small flimsy pieces of paper, folded twice over to make 4 leaves. Each quarto contained a single play, and while some were quite accurate, in other cases some had rather dubious contents. These quote-unquote bad quartos were often just written from vague memory. They didn't preserve the play word for word, and the verses were jumbled, lines were missing, and other parts of the play were simply paraphrased. In other words, they were cheap Shakespeare knockoffs, sold for about a sixpence. That's about £5 or $6 in today's money. In light of these, quote, stolen and surreptitious copies, a group of Shakespeare's friends and colleagues, notably 2 actors from Shakespeare's dramatic company, John Hemmings and Henry Condell, collected his works into one official document. Being actors for Shakespeare himself, they were able to faithfully memorise much of the plays themselves. But, to fill in any gaps, they used whatever they could find. Any of the good quartos, prompt books lying about, and in some cases, Shakespeare's private working drafts. All of these original documents, being paper, are now likely lost to history. But, finally, some 7 years later, in 1623, John Hemmings and Henry Condell published the First Folio, a definitive collection of Shakespeare's works. You can think of it as an early Shakespeare canon. It contained 36 plays, 18 of which had never been officially published. Plays like Twelfth Night, Macbeth, Julius Caesar and The Tempest. Had their first folio not been published, these plays might never have survived. Needless to say, the First Folio is one of the most important books ever written in the English language. It contains some of the finest poems and plays ever written. Nowadays, if you were to pick up a copy of the complete works of Shakespeare, what you're reading is taken from the First Folio. However, the First Folio didn't preserve all of Shakespeare's works. The collection is known to omit 2 of his plays, Pericles and Edward III. Whether these plays were actually authored by Shakespeare is still heavily debated and outside the scope of this video, but both are believed to have been partially written by Shakespeare. In fact, it was quite common for playwrights to collaborate. In the last phase of his career, Shakespeare collaborated with John Fletcher to produce plays like Henry VIII and Two Noble Kingsmen. Think of it as a sort of Shakespeare collab. Anyway, both these texts, Pericles and Edward III, are now included into the Shakespeare canon, and thus complete the collection. Well, or so you'd think. Act 2. The Lost History of Cardenio. In 1653, nearly 4 decades after Shakespeare's death, a record book called The Stationer's Register made an entry that Shakespeare put on a play in 1613 going by the name of the History of Cardenio. Another clue is the name, Cardenio. Cardenio is a character in the Spanish novel Don Quixote, written by Miguel de Cervantes, with an English translation published in 1612, the year before the History of Cardenio was allegedly performed. If you're unfamiliar with Don Quixote, it's a great story. It's all about a man called Alonso who believes that he is a knight, and he takes the name Don Quixote and decides to go on many chivalric misadventures, meeting many curious characters along the way. One of which is a man called Cardenio. In this particular episode, Don and his partner Sancho meet this strange hermit in the mountains who tells them both a sad story of a failed love. Many years ago, Cardenio was due to marry his lover Lucinda. For help with this, Cardenio asked his friend, Don Ferdinando to arrange a wedding. But when Don Ferdinando laid eyes upon Lucinda, he decided to steal her from Cardenio. At the same time, Don Ferdinando was already betrothed to a young woman called Dorothea. Don Ferdinando hatches a plan. He sends Cardenio on an errand, and with him out the picture, he asks Lucinda's father for her hand in marriage. Surprisingly, the father agrees, and the wedding between the two is underway. Cardenio returns from his errand and stumbles across the wedding. Hiding behind a tapestry, he watches the event as it unfolds. At the climactic moment when the vows are exchanged, Lucinda, dismayed, agrees to marry Don Ferdinando, and the knot is tied between her and her treacherous new husband. Devastated, Cardenio runs away to live in the mountains. Yet sometime later, Lucinda runs away from Don Ferdinando, and realizing the error of his ways, Don Ferdinando finds Cardenio and finally apologizes. Cardenio forgives him, and then is reunited with Lucinda. Finally, Don Ferdinando makes things up with Dorothea. It's this story that could have been the plot of Shakespeare's play that supposedly happened in 1613. The dates seem to add up. We know that translation of Don Quixote was published in England in 1612, the year before, and so Shakespeare may have had access to the source material from which to base his play around. As for an actual play or script, well, we don't have it. Since a copy of it is not in the first folio, the contents of the play is lost. It would be a miracle should one of these original quarto manuscripts ever be found. Act 3. Double Falsehood. Well, such a miracle may have happened. Our story takes us to the 13th of December, 1727, 111 years after Shakespeare's death. It was the opening night of a much discussed play in London. The play's name was Double Falsehood and was presented to the public by Lewis Theobald. The title page of the published version reads as following: written originally by W. Shakespeare and now revised and adapted to stage by Mr. Theobald. Looking at the language of the play, and it seems quite Shakespearean. For an 18th century theatregoer, this all would have been very antiquated, and so the claims made by Double Falsehood may indeed seem authentic. But the most intriguing part of the play is its plot. In 5 acts, Double Falsehood tells us the story of Cardenio from Don Quixote. Except that now, the characters' names have changed. Cardenio becomes Julio, Lucinda becomes Leonora, Don Ferdinando is turned into Henriquez, and Dorothea into Violante. And aside from some added violence and grit, Double Falsehood is remarkably similar to the story of Cardenio. So how can we make sense of these two pieces of evidence? We have this play, Double Falsehood, that tells the story of Cardenio, and independent of this, we have evidence that there was indeed a play performed in 1613 called The History of Cardenio. This can't be a coincidence. There must be something more. Well, the play's publisher, Lewis Theobald, claimed to have come into 3 manuscripts of an unnamed play of Shakespeare that he collected together and edited into a single work, which he titled Double Falsehood. He was secretive on where he got those manuscripts, leading many to believe that he forged them himself. Theobald was a lawyer by trade, but in recent years had become a writer, fascinated with Shakespeare and very familiar with his work. It is entirely possible he had a decent level of knowledge in which to produce a plausible forgery of Shakespeare. Many see Double Falsehood as an imitation of Shakespeare's work, and a good one at that. It uses his vocabulary and style. Either way, such claims dogged Theobald's career, and the play never took off. He sold the rights away and faded away from the spotlight. And in the following centuries, nobody really gave any attention to Double Falsehood, simply assuming that indeed it probably was a forgery. But in recent years, scholars have challenged the view that Double Falsehood is an out-and-out forgery. On a closer look at the script, it seems that 3 distinct writing styles make up the play. 3 sets of vocabulary and 3 sets of influences. These 3 voices of Double Falsehood. The first voice appears most prominently in Acts 1, 2 and the first part of Act 3. The style and language are very close to Shakespeare's later plays. The second voice comes in at Acts 4 and 5, except that is, it uses a more modern turn of phrase. Instead of hath and doth, it prefers has and does, much like how we'd say it nowadays. And finally, the third voice crops up throughout the play, sometimes in individual sentences, and other times in full paragraphs. It bridges the gaps for the other 2 voices. A lot of the vocabulary and phrasing it uses doesn't really seem very Shakespearean. It even references political events, dating it to sometime in the early 1700s. This has challenged the idea that Double Falsehood is a simple forgery. If Theobald was able to construct 3 textual voices in his play, each with a distinct vocabulary and phraseology, then he would have been a mastermind counterfeiter, which to me, and many others, seems quite unlikely. Scholars argue that voice 3, the one that appears throughout the play and bridges the gaps between other writers, is most likely Theobald's himself. We know that Theobald edited the play out of an existing manuscript, so his traces in the play seem to be stitching the whole thing together. That leaves us with voices 1 and 2, the original voices who wrote the play. Voice 1 is Acts 1, 2 and 3, and voice 2 is Acts 4 and 5. So it's believed that Acts 1, 2 and 3 preserved a text believed to be Shakespeare himself. It's the more antiquated of the two, and many language studies have linked the vocabulary to a lot of Shakespeare's plays, especially those later ones. And the rest of the play, likewise, Acts 4 and 5 do appear to have language and phrasing most similar to John Fletcher. So putting it all together, Acts 1, 2 and 3 are Shakespeare, Acts 4 and 5 John Fletcher, and the whole thing is tied together and stitched up by Lewis Theobald, the editor. Double Falsehood preserves the remains of the original play Cardenio, as alluded to in the Stationer's Register in 1653. Lewis Theobald's bold claim that Shakespeare wrote his play largely holds up, but instead of Shakespeare writing the whole play, it's more that traces and remnants of Shakespeare can be found within the play, especially in the early half. The only thing we can't be certain of is how Theobald actually got hold of those 3 manuscripts. With the text of Cardenio, he was very secretive about this precious piece of evidence, and since we no longer have it today, we must assume that the original Cardenio manuscripts were destroyed. So, what's left in Double Falsehood is probably our best look at this lost play of Shakespeare. Well, there you have it, Cardenio, the lost play of Shakespeare. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I want to keep experimenting with all the videos I make, and keep exploring obscure topics that deserve more attention. So, if you'd like to see more, why not subscribe? A like and a comment really help out too. And if you haven't already, I'm on Instagram and Twitter now. I'm aiming to put some behind the scenes content out on there. Anyway, I look forward to seeing you next time. Goodbye.